fantastic. So I'm just going to do some quick housekeeping and then I'm going to pass over to Ashley. So as you can see, the webinar is being recorded. We will send this to you in an email in the coming days so you can have it. Please do participate. If you have any questions or anything, you can pop them in the Q&A box below, either throughout the webinar, or we'll also have a kind of a quick 10-minute Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So I'm going to pass you over to Ashley now, who is a lecturer in organisational behaviour, and she has a great deck prepared for you today as well. So Ashley, when you're ready.
Okay, thank you so much, Aislinn, and welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm delighted to be invited by the Professional Academy to talk about the dark side of leadership. And even if it's not the happiest of themes, I think it's really important to open this conversation. In my experience, difficult managers are a fact of life. And if judged by the interest in the webinar and indeed the number of questions we received for our advice clinic, unfortunately, it's a very common occurrence that has wide-ranging implications for people, both personally and professionally. We spend so much of our waking hours at work that it's really important that we're operating in an environment that enables us to bring the best of ourselves to the workplace. One would assume that dysfunctional leaders and the toxic workplaces they create would be a distinct liability for organisations. But often their behaviour is actually perpetrated by an organisational culture that either turns a blind eye to their behaviour or indeed acts as a breeding ground for toxic leaders. Unfortunately, this culture then reinforces the dysfunctionality. Problems will arise if the boss's psychological makeup is warped in some way, and then all the systems and structures of the firm begin to reflect that person's pathologies. A surprising number of senior executives do have a personality disorder of some kind, and the consequences of this for their staff are not insignificant. I speak from personal experience, having encountered one such very problematic leader early in my career, and not in UCD, I hasten to add. But I witnessed someone who wreaked havoc on a dedicated workforce, destroyed the morale of decent people, and actually did untold damage to people's personal lives. In truth, I think being part of that experience and witnessing what I saw is in some way what led me to study in the area of organisational behaviour, to try and figure out what is going on. And in many ways, I suppose it's that all of that really is why I do the work that I do. And why working in the business school, I suppose I have a passion for trying to improve the quality of leadership at all levels of organisations. Indeed, through my teaching here at Smurfit, if I had a penny for every student who's asked for a coffee to discuss some particular troubling relationship at work, I would be a very wealthy woman. So the first thing I would say is, if you are struggling in this space, the really key takeaway to begin with is that you are very much not alone. But people are often reluctant to discuss their problems, for fear it will reflect badly on their ability to do their jobs, that they appear that they can't manage the situation, or they're weak, or they might worry indeed that if they do something, it'll get back to their boss and make things worse. Sadly, they often blame themselves for circumstances in which they find themselves. And really, so many of these things are not your fault. My time today is limited in the session, so let's move on and look at some of the key themes. So I want to talk a little bit around the context and what I call the romance of leadership. And then I want to move on and look at power dynamics, the use and abuse of power. We're then going to explore a typology of toxic leaders, because they're not all the same. And then lastly, look at coping mechanisms and well-being. So to get the ball rolling, as we go along, I'll also be dealing with some of the questions that you sent into the advice clinic, so we'll pick those up. But to start off, I'd really like to do a very sort of quick sort of finger in the air check in with you, and the questions on the screen. Off the top of your head, what words do you sort of automatically associate with leadership? And I just want you to fire some of those into the chat function so that we can get a very quick temperature check.
Oh, someone just wrote in there. Yeah, the chat is disabled just because it's a webinar feature, but you can write in the Q&A box, so it should
Oh,
be
sorry.
some there at the
Yeah.
bottom there beside it, to the right of it is on my screen. Someone that said there they used the word serve.
To serve, yes, absolutely.
Communication. Someone else
Mm-hmm.
said vision. There's another word that came in there.
Lovely.
Power, nurture, power dynamics, honesty, trust. We're getting loads now. Vision and understanding, control, inspire, inspiring, another one. Influential, decisiveness, compassion, set example, direct, responsibility, support. We have a few supports there. Guide,
Okay.
authenticity, strong, um, decisive, inspiring, to set examples. We've a few kind of inspire, guidance, empowerment, integrity. So that's kind of the theme of them there, Ashley.
Okay, thank you so much, Aislinn, for that. So, and thank you to everybody who contributed. So, first off, when I hear that list of language, the overarching message is the positivity of how we view leadership as essentially a good thing. So we talk about it nurturing, and like the first word that came up was to serve, which is very much how leadership is viewed, providing support, nurturing people, giving vision. And in the discipline, if you think of the sort of the literature and the publications, leadership is one topic that it's the most widely researched area, and there's so much written about it. There's endless books. I used to track on Amazon how many books about leadership were published per month, and on average worldwide, it was something in the range of 4,000 or 5,000. So, excuse me, there's a huge raft of thinking around leadership being essentially good. And what I want to move on, hold on, sorry, yeah. So we talk about the romance of leadership, and this is the idea that, as I say, we tend to view leadership positively, but we also tend to view it as a really critical, important factor for the success or failure of organizations. Now, the reality is that actually there are very few firm causal links between leadership and organizational performance. And the reason for this are manifold. One of them is what we call the homogeneity of leaders. We tend, by and large, to not deviate too much from a particular style of leader. So organizations, when they're sort of replacing their senior figures, often there's sort of a pipeline coming through of people who are more or less quite similar. So we get a lot of similarity, so therefore you don't get too much of a shake-up. There's also constraints on leader behaviour. If you think of, excuse me, things like shareholders and key stakeholders that will exercise a degree of control over what the leader can do. So a leader might have great ideas and plans, but the shareholders may think differently. And then there's the simple functioning of the business life cycle. And we know that different industries do well, whether it's boom or bust, whether we're in recession and contracting mode versus being in expansive mode. And even today, as I talk with you, there's weather warnings for parts of the country. And if you think of what happens with that, you know, if you're in the business of selling raincoats and umbrellas and heating oil, you're going to do very well this weekend. But if you're a small coffee shop or, you know, say an open air event, well, then clearly your business is going to be curtailed. So there's a lot of both externalities and internal factors that shape what happens to organizations and in terms of their performance. And on the screen here, you see the picture of the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. And of course, that created havoc with supply chains. But in the university here, we've got a master's program in supply chain. And what happened after this event was that the number of participants in that program expanded threefold. Because now that and Brexit and other things, you see, supply chains are invisible until they break. And then there was a huge surge in interest in learning and understanding and the importance of supply chain management. So yet again, that's something that happened, the other side of the world and has an impact on us. You all know the impact of COVID-19, the winners and the losers, a boom for the pharmaceutical industry and a disaster for so many others. The weather events we've spoken about, things like social media can make or break an organization and its products. Good publicity or bad publicity. And of course, then regulation can change how an organization functions. The other things that matter are things like if there's a high performance culture, well, then maybe the leadership doesn't matter so much. Or if we think of companies that have highly automated processes and systems, so the technology runs the business. And indeed, a strong union can actually thwart the agenda of the most capable leader. So it's not all about the leader. But there is a but, and this is what we call sense-making and attributions. And Harold Kelly observed that we look at leadership through a different lens, because whether or not it makes a difference, it matters greatly because people believe it does. And if you look at poor Eric, who got his marching cards recently from Man United, and the new guy is in today trying to work a miracle, and you can see how we do believe that if we change the leader, that we will change the outcomes. So in order to sort of progress the conversation, we need to get our heads around a good understanding of power. And French and Bell described it as the ability to affect organizational outcomes. So to direct. And the interesting thing about power, of course, is that it can be real power or perceived power. So once I perceive somebody as being in a position of power, well, then that shapes things, and it's going to influence behavior. So power is not a trait of a person, but rather it's an outcome, or what we call the property of a social relation. So it's a function of the context. I can't say I've got power without saying over what or over whom. So what is the relationship and what is the dynamic? And in the workplace, that leads us to ask an interesting question. When, as a leader, is it better to be loved or feared? And this is interesting because there's a whole, I suppose, raft of behavioral science research that shows when judging people, especially leaders, we look at two characteristics. We look at their warmth or their likability factor. Are they somebody that we warm and think we can trust? And then we look at their degree of whether they are fearsome. Are they strength or strong? Do they have agency? Do they come across as being competent in their area? And these two primary dimensions of social judgment are important because we're trying to answer two key questions. What is this person's intentions towards me, and is he or she capable of acting on those? So we're trying to weigh up the risks of what we're dealing with. Now, there was a fascinating study done by Zenger and Folkman when they analysed 50,000 leaders, and they found that only 27 of them were rated as being in the lowest quartile on warmth, but the highest on overall effectiveness. In other words, the chances of a leader who is strongly disliked being considered as effective is only about 1 in 2,000. So the way to influence people positively is to begin with warmth. Yet we seem to live in a world where so many leaders tend to emphasize their strength and their competence, and they're sort of the opposite side. So there's a gap between what we know from the research and how people behave. And this leads me to, I suppose, addressing one of the first really good questions we got in, where a person is asking, how can I manage an underperformer without creating resentment or a toxic team environment? And if this person is on the call, the first thing I would say to you is, first of all, your job is to manage an underperformer. That's what you are needed to do. That's the art of management. And so your team are also expecting you to do it. So they're looking and observing closely to see how you go about it. And when you're looking at an underperformer, you're always asking the question, what's driving the behavior? Is it can't do or won't do? So if it's can't do, it can be issues around training, around their ability or the degree of support they've got in the role. If it's won't do, well, then it's an attitude issue, and it's a problem around motivation. It's a different dynamic. But the first thing I would say to you is, firstly, you do have to address it. Secondly, you have to communicate really clear performance standards so that an individual knows what performance looks like. And then the third thing is, I think, to move from your performance management being an event, which is often sort of the HR model, there's a meeting and a form to be filled in, but rather to view it as a process so that it's an ongoing conversation. And I think if you do it, they always say, praise in public and sort of, punish in private. Now punish is probably the harsh word, but if you have to give people your comments on and bring them to insight around areas where they're not where they need to be, my advice to you would be, first of all, to avoid the word feedback, because the F word just instantly creates resentment and gets people's heckles up. But so I would talk around, can I talk around what I've noticed or what I've observed? And the other advice I would say is never use the words but and however. You did a great job, but, or your report was wonderful, however. They just take all of the oxygen out of the statement. Instead, use the word and. You did a wonderful presentation, and I think it would be even best if you tried something else. So offer some advice. So I think the legitimate right is to manage the underperformance, but doing it with dignity and respecting the person is the way to go. So when we talk about power, the main framework that's most useful is the French and Raven's 5 bases of social power. And what I'm bringing you through here is the different ways in which power is presented. So I'm going to fly through these fairly rapidly because they're fairly easily sort of absorbed. The first one is reward power, which is the ability to dole out, whatever are the rewards of the organization, whether it's the promotions or the resources or the pay increases, whatever it would be. So clearly it's good to trade favors with those people. Second power is a bit more damaging, coercive power, to make life hard for people, threats of undesirable outcomes. And when you are working with somebody who rules by coercive power, you want to avoid getting his or her back up. It's often, I think, linked now more so to passive aggressive behaviour, because there's been general shift away, thank goodness, away from, overt aggressive expressions at work. Now, not in all places, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but coercive power is that damaging one. Here's an example of coercive power in action. And clearly it's Putin and Angela Merkel. But the reason it's a passive-aggressive power play is because Merkel is terrified of dogs, having been bitten as a child. And you can see that, look, the expression on her face, and she's watching, and that was a power play, and a really disrespectful way to go about it. But it's a very clear example. Legitimate power is based on the power of accepted authority. So obviously the Garda's power to stop you, but also this is the power of being the boss, that you have the power base to manage your people day in, day out, in terms of, a range of what's acceptable within the business environment. Sometimes you get legitimate power if you're the representative of a powerful group, so maybe a union representative or something like that. And then the fourth power base is referent power, which is the likability factor. So this is the one where it's very much within the person, that a person is perceived and liked by their staff. And that in turn drives the desire to please that person. So if you think of any sort of team, but once you're managing people, your job is not to be everybody's best friend. That's not your role. But that's not to say that you can't obviously exhibit personal warmth towards people. And from the research, we know that that's a hugely important way to go. The fifth power base is expert power, which is around information. And this has to be credible, trustworthy, and relevant. And what I mean by that is that the expertise resides within a certain discipline. So I'll trust my doctor to advise me on my healthcare, but I might not ask his or her opinion on what laptop to buy because it's not their bag. So this is always going to be sort of around their particular area, and we give respect to people who have this power base. Now, in order to use this to influence others, you do have to present your credentials first. You have to set out, what is it about you that is the basis of your expertise. Now, there are other sorts of power, what we call soft power. And it can be the power of who you know, social connections, alliances. You think of the relationship between Ireland and the United States and how that has been nurtured and protected over the years, and the importance that it serves to us, and indeed on both sides of the Atlantic. So, as I say, other strains of power. So when we look at that and the connection between leadership and power, we're really looking to see, how do leaders view power and how do they use it? And what you want and hope in life is that they will use it for the good, to bring out the best in others. And this is referred to as using power for social benefit. So it's to lift everybody. So you want to be in a position of influence so that you can make things better for others. And power is not a dirty word. Unless power is exercised, then nothing gets done. So it's really important to have this, but in terms of how we use it. Now, the other sort of more negative way is to reign tyranny over a toxic workplace through the negative use of power. And that is often driven by what we call personal power, this desire to be, to be important, to be, I heard working with a colleague recently, said, why does he have to be the man? That somebody wants to be this really sort of a powerful person for themselves. It's an ego-driven thing. So we do know that people who are like that, they have a really strong appetite for power. So we can see then the consequences of that is that for those who pursue this, the wealth or the power, we can end up with all sorts of dysfunctions in organizations, unethical behavior, illegal, things that are despicable, reprehensible, fraud, the whole 10 yards all springs from this. So the question arises is, are some people more susceptible to this variant of power than others? And there's a famous study done in Stanford called the Cookie Monster study. And what they were trying to do was test the unconscious effects of leadership. So they put a group of volunteers, a whole room of people, and they divided them into groups of three, but they kept the genders together. So 3 groups of women, 3 groups of men, and quite a number of them. And in each group, one person was randomly appointed into a leadership position and given a bit of authority. So they were told, listen, if it comes down to indecision, you've got the casting vote. And they were given a quiz of questions to deal with. So they fired away, did their work, and when they handed up their answer sheets, the experimenters said to them, listen, we're going to score these. While we're doing that, would you like to enjoy some refreshments? And they gave each group of 3 a tray that had 3 glasses of juice and a cookie or plate with 4 cookies on it. And this was really what the experiment was around, because they were waiting to see who was going to eat the 4th cookie. And lo and behold, guess who ate it? Well, the leader ate it. In a significant number of cases, the leader ate it. And that showed that even temporary power can make us unconsciously egocentric. And so authority goes to people's heads. And they also noted that not alone did they take the cookie, but the researchers described them as eating in what they refer to as a socially disinhibited way. So they threw crumbs everywhere. They didn't tidy up after themselves. They didn't care if there was a mess left. So kind of the rules don't apply to me behavior. So that can be a little bit worrying. And when we think of the organization context, we think, well, how do people gain power? Well, it's all of these. It's controlling something of importance, whether it's usually money is the big one, you know, or resources or access to people, whatever it would be. So you control resource, you're central to what the organization does. So you play a key part in the product or service. Critically, you're hard to substitute. So you've created a niche area for yourself. So it's very hard to get rid of you because maybe you hoard information or you retain control over, you know, a particular process or a system or something like that. And then lastly, if you're involved in managing and reducing uncertainty, because organizations don't like uncertainty. So there are sort of the strategies that people will often position themselves in order to be powerful. So what I have before you is a very sort of long laundry list of just examples of abuses of power. And I'm sure you can throw your eye over these and probably check some boxes as you move down. Claiming credit for the work of others is a fairly common one. Scapegoating, fairness, unfairness, preferential treatment, resentment and envy. Oh, it's a wonderful cocktail, this. And then we get retaliation and sabotage and bullying. But even the timing of events, I think, is power plays. You know, it's no random event that we learn about a bicycle shed months before a general election. You know, so the bicycle shed goes back to June 21, but people will have powerful knowledge and information, and the timing of it and when it's released is always interesting. So within the reality of life as well, then you have the politics of power. You have in-groups and out-groups, and I often refer to these as the inner circle and the out, or the Arctic circle, that some people are on the inside track and then others who are literally left out in the cold. So let's move on and look at some of the toxic leaders that you may encounter. And here I'm drawing on the work of Roy Lubbock. And we know the outcome of toxic leaders. They leave a wake of personal and professional heartache behind them. You can see they derail your work and your projects. They destroy morale. And ultimately, it's very hard to not allow this to spill over and affect your personal well-being in your private life. And ultimately, they can destroy your career. So the starting points of what we're dealing with here in terms of toxicity is enduring patterns of behavior. So it's not just an off day, like we all have off days, but this is their modus operandi. It is the business as usual pattern. And Manfred Ketster-Vries coined the phrase mental demons, that they have, you know, thought processes going on in their heads that kind of are problematic. And on the right-hand side of the screen, I've put in the Big Five personality framework. And if this is one of the big tools we use for understanding personality. And on the right in the green there, you will see neuroticism. And neuroticism is really the degree to which we are emotionally stable or unstable. And that's a big driver and critical attribute of leader behavior, because what we want are leaders who are emotionally stable. And the test of stability is not when the sea is calm, but when it is problematic, when there's a crisis, when things have failed, when errors and mistakes have been made. And that's the test of the stability. So we want leaders that are calm and unflappable. What we don't want are leaders that are, we never know which kind of version of the individual is going to show up on a given day. And this, of course, links into problematic leaders having poor emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is two variants. The first bit is your personal competence, your ability to read your own feelings, to be self-aware around your own strengths and weaknesses, and to manage those feelings effectively. So yet again, if things go wrong, that you don't lose it completely, that you're able to manage your emotional responses. The second part is social competence, and that's understanding what other people are feeling and being able to build effective working relationships. So we do know that toxic managers typically struggle in this area. So yet again, one of the questions we got in, how can I begin to recognize if I'm going down the path of toxicity? And the one thing I'd say is, if the author of this question is on the call, I am not in the least bit worried about you. And the reason I say that is because you already have this on your radar, and that will act as a huge protection to you not going into that space. The problem with toxic managers is that they don't sign up for programs, or they don't come back to college to learn, because they don't believe they have anything to learn. So the whole wording of your question tells me about you, that you're interested in being the best version of yourself that you can, and that you're very much open to improving and taking feedback. And my advice to you would be, if you're people managing, don't go into your staff and say, can you give me some advice on how I'm managing you? Because that really makes staff uncomfortable. But to think how you might word the question, what could I do that could help you be more effective in your role? That's a much better, excuse me, conversation opener. Or could you tell me, I'd be really grateful if you could tell me if there's something I could do more of or do less of that would help you perform your role. So yet again, as I say, where possible, avoid the feedback, the F word. It's just problematic. So now let's really get down to business and start dealing with, I suppose, the most problematic characteristics are the narcissistic managers, and they come in two strains. The first are the ones where it's ingrained from childhood. So it's within them. And it's possibly because they were raised in environments where, excuse me, they were made to feel they were never good enough. So what you're dealing with is a really fragile self-esteem. There's a hollowness inside that is huge, and they build these sort of protective walls around them. They're very defensive, and they kind of go on the attack. So sort of arrogance and all of that is the first sort of port of behavioral call they will make. They're very adept at being devoid of empathy for other people, and they're willing to exploit others. Outrageously ambitious is the classic characteristic, and so it's power and prestige at all costs. They also live in a binary world, and in their world, you're either for them or against them. And if you're against them, then you're a target to be taken down. So a really problematic. They tend to be very charming when they're managing up in the organization, and very harsh then when they're managing down. The second variation are what we call learned narcissism. And excuse me, these people, by contrast, have a very robust self-esteem. They think they're great. And it's often because they've been let behave like a jerk. Maybe it's often because they're great at something in life. They might be great in the sports field, or they're great at bringing in new business, or they're great at charming the clients. And so that sort of magic bit then becomes an excuse for not tackling inappropriate behavior. So these characters really want to be flattered. They're full of self-importance and entitlement, but often blind to their impact on people. I often think they don't realize the impact they have, and they suffer greatly from "do you not know who I am" syndrome. And if you ever find those words floating through your head, then you know to give yourself a slap. So an example of this at play is back during the great economic recession, and you had the CEOs of the top car companies in the States rocking up to Washington and looking for a bailout. And they all rocked up on their corporate jets. So it's this notion that you can have the narcissists who live in a bubble, and they're so disconnected from reality. So if you're reporting to such a person, the advice is consistent, and it is this: it's confrontation doesn't work. You're not going to change this person, and if there's no point trying to upset their sense of self. So don't criticize them, don't outshine them, and the advice is actually to flatter them. Document your work, keep a really clear record of what you do and when, find a mentor to offer you support, and really update your CV and get as far away from them as you possibly can. And whilst it might gall you to say, well, why do I flatter this person? What I would say to you is, if you take them on, they will take you, it's the power base, they will take you down. And think of the long game. Flattery is get you through the day. The long game is, what's your plan? And make a plan to get away from them. And that's eventually what I did in my own experience. Aggressive managers are the competitive dog-eat-dog variety, often bullies, and they justify it because they feel they've been hard done by in the past. So you can see the behaviours they manage by fear. When you're dealing with this variant, you really have to watch your back, and where possible, avoid them. And this is where, working from home or using, those tools can be advantageous. Know what their triggers are. So you have to be very observant to know what what's going to set them off. I think it's a good idea to communicate in writing, because that provides a record. And also, I think it is good to assert yourself and push back, but I'm very wary of giving general advice when I don't know the specifics of the personality that you're dealing with. But we do know that bullies often, when you stand up to them, that they are people of straw really underneath, and they often will pull back. So I think it's a judgment call for you, but I think it's something that you do need to consider how you're going to do so, and I think you can do so respectfully. With passive aggressive behaviour, this is where they're outwardly accommodating, but underhand in terms of being obstructive. So it's not that they don't reply to your email, it's that they just don't, or they won't say, I disagree with you, they just won't challenge you, or they ignore you, or they don't get back to you, or whatever. So these people, actually, their challenge in life is communication. They struggle with the emotional, the EQ bit. It's struggling to express what they feel, often accompanied with low self-esteem. So internally, they don't feel great, and often a resentment towards authority. You recognize it because they manage by sarcasm or silence. So if they're not happy with you, they seethe internally. So instead of being able to have an adult conversation, they will very much they will be it's the side comments or the silent treatment. And if you try and tackle that, they will become hugely defensive, and they're never going to see it as being their fault. Interestingly, they actually can respond well to coaching, because it'll deal with this, but it's whether or not you're in a position where you're able to suggest coaching for them is the problem. Then we have rigid managers, and rigid managers are my way or the highway folk. They are they're often authoritarian, old school, traditional. They're very traditional views of power, and this is they're reluctant to show any vulnerability, as they see that as weakness. And that's down to the model of leadership that they have in their heads. Like, they believe leadership is, around, always being in charge and always being right, and nobody else knows anything as well as I do. And you end up with micromanagement. And yet again, we had a question on what to do around an individual who sees their manager moving in this direction. Now, obviously, I have no context. I don't know if this is a new employee in a role. I don't know if they've suddenly got a new leader or manager. So I don't know the frame. But if it's happening, micromanagement, it's two things. It's a style thing or a trust thing. And style is how we operate. And that's often where personality profiling can be really useful. And indeed, it's something that we do on the MIM in my module as one of the very early assignments, where we start to learn how much control are we comfortable with in our lives. Are you the person that has a very defined plan for the weekend, or is freewheeling it? Because micromanagement is a style issue in a lot of ways. So it can be really useful to talk about, how do our styles complement or differ? And these are conversations that should be going on in the workspace. If it's a trust issue, well, then I would advise the employee to see, obviously the micromanager has it's their anxieties around your competence that's at issue. So can you put in structures that are going to manage that more effectively? Could you perhaps take control and say, right, well, let's have these particular time slot meetings when I update you on what's going on, in the expectation that the rest of the time they kind of leave you to get on with it. But I think communication is important. The last group are impaired managers, and I'm not going to talk much about these because the answer is that they need professional support. And that's where we need to tap into the support mechanisms of an organisation and such things like, the HR as being the first port of call, but tuning into employee assistance programs and such like. So just a few things to wrap up as time moves on. When we're dissatisfied in work, and this is a model we use and I teach, and there's generally 4 things people can do. You leave the situation. If you've options and you're not happy, well, then get out of it. Go to, excuse me, another division or another organisation. You might voice your speak up to try and change things, and you will only do that if you believe that you've some hope of getting progress. So do you involve HR? Do you talk to a union? Do you speak to another manager in the organisation? You'll only do it, as I say, if you think that there's a chance of change, but it can be a really useful thing to do. Loyalty is to sit it out. You look and weigh up the situation, and maybe you think, well, the person who's problematic in your world, maybe they're going to be moved to a different area of the business, maybe they're going to retire, maybe they're going off on a career break or whatever it would be, or maybe you're going to get to move on. So you might just sit it out. And then lastly is neglect, where you will disconnect emotionally. So you try and limit the damage that's being done to you. And that often translates into people simply caring less about their work and finding joy in other areas of their life. It's often accompanied by high absenteeism. So the question was, what can I do if my boss is toxic? And the answer, I hate to say it, but it depends on your ability to diagnose the situation. If you're dealing with a narcissist, I think the problem is great. And if they're the senior figure and there's nobody above them, well, then it's very hard to go down that road. If they're not the most senior figure, if they're, somewhere, there's people senior to them who you think are reasonable and amenable, well, then that can be a way in. But I would always consult what I call a few organisational wise owls to get their take on it. If you're dealing with an aggressive manager, I think there is opportunity to push back. Communicate boundaries in this day and age, I think, is important, and to assert yourself politely. I'm not great if somebody if I come up against this aggressive behaviour, I'm not the best in the moment at responding, and I'm likely to say the wrong thing. So I usually go away and think about it and gather my thoughts really carefully, and then come back and engage with the person politely around, the event and my feelings towards it. So I set down markers in terms of how, and often it's around, well, I wouldn't treat you that way, so please, I'd be grateful if you give me the same courtesy. 360 feedback can be useful, and what you want is hopefully a good HR function. Speaking up takes courage, and you do have to weigh up the risks. A phrase I use when I'm teaching is, can you afford your principles? You may want to speak up, but you have to think very carefully around the consequences of that. And if you're fighting City Hall, if they're basically all the same at the top, it becomes very problematic. And I know that's not great to hear, and it's not probably the magic solution, but it's probably the harsh reality of organizational life. There are also people I think are genuinely lacking self-awareness, and they don't realize how they're come across or how they're perceived. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity with those people to hold up the mirror, because they are open to self-improvement. And I think we do have it's important to be able to manage that in the workplace. I got quite questions around it being accepted by senior leadership, and particularly in healthcare. And then what you're dealing with is dysfunctional cultures. And dysfunctional cultures are, we could do, I've said I could teach 12 weeks on culture, but that is very hard to fix, because what you find is it's intergenerational. If people, well, this was the tough scene I had to go through, so now that I'm powerful, I'm going to make your life hell as well. And the only thing I can say is, if you're in the middle of that, the only thing you control is how you manage your people. So to try and be the break stop so that you don't replicate that down. And the more people are educated, and where their skills of management are honed through learning. Like, none of us are born knowing how to manage people. So the extent to which you're engaged and invested in that learning will help break these patterns. But unfortunately, there's no quick fixes. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to say, watch your energy and your emotion, and be kind to yourself, and surround yourself with people who are good and care for you, and that will, offer you an external perspective. People who will remind you of your wins and your talents, and use them as a resource. And then I think lastly, I want to end on an upbeat note. And Rosabeth Moss-Cantor always said that even the powerless have power. And I heard Ardal O'Hanlon being interviewed on TV recently. I think it was the Late Late Show, and he was talking about when he worked at a check-in in Dublin Airport, and this pompous character came up and was really treating him badly. And, I'm going to Washington and I'm business class and I'm important and I want the best flight and the best seat, and, don't you, laddie boy, be messing me around. So Ardal gave him the fantastic seat, but then sent his luggage to Warsaw, which I thought was a wonderful vindication of the powerless. I'm not advocating that we all become revolutionaries, but there is always the power of the powerless. So as I said, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mairead now. But if you stick to the 3 H's of leadership, humility, humanity, and humour, and if you hold those in your hearts, then I think you will probably do a really good job in managing people. And I wish you well. And I hope to see you on your academic journey along the way. So, Mairead, can I send it your way?
Sorry, thank you so much, Ashley. And everybody, thank you for coming today and attending the webinar. And I suppose after that, as I'm sure you will agree, superb, insightful and enlightening session on leadership. I'd like to take this opportunity to just give you a brief introduction to our Masters in Management online programme, which is a part-time programme and completely online here at Smurfit Business School. And based in terms of relevance to our session there, as you would expect, a key component of this Masters is honing and developing our students' leadership skills and basically giving them the tools to be effective, empathetic, and, after everything we've heard today, you'd like to think fair and, as I said, effective leaders in various sectors and businesses internationally and domestically. So we'll just go through very quickly. Actually, we go on to the next slide, a little bit about Smurfit. So just a little bit about our business school here. It's one of Ireland's leading and top-ranked business schools. In terms of our global impact, we're among the first, if I could just talk here, apologies. We're in the top 1% of business schools globally. There's about 15,600 business schools, and we're in the top 1% of that. We have a huge global alumni network, which is 114,000 alumni at the moment. And there's, as I said, there's so much to leverage off that in general terms. And I suppose the beauty about our Management Online program is exactly that. It's online. So you don't actually have to attend campus. You can do it from anywhere that you're based in the world. We also have a dedicated careers team who help you with, you know, your career whilst you're here, and even when you're a graduate, in terms of that next step you want to take, giving you advice, giving you interview preparation, and working with you to achieve your career objectives, essentially. And I won't go into this in any detail now, but we also have one of the key elements of our master's programs here at Smurfit is our Global Leadership Program, which again is developing those skills around leadership, around self-awareness, around communication, etc. The next slide, please, Ashley. The Masters in Management is a program, and this is, you know, the perception sometimes that if you're going to do a Masters in Management, you need a background in business or you need a previous business degree. This is specifically a program for non-business graduates. So students from every discipline are welcome, and we would warmly accept your applications. So as I said, it's for non-business students, and again, just to reiterate that there is a focus on leadership development. Thank you. Just very quickly, and I'm very conscious again of the time, the eligibility and application process for this master's, the minimum or the main criteria that we have is that you hold a second-class honours degree in a non-business discipline. In exceptional circumstances, we will accept applications from non-degree holders that would have a lot of experience and typically have, you know, experience managing people and leading in their workplace, etc. And an interview would probably be held to, you know, before enrolment. The application for our Management Online program is online, as you would imagine. The documents you need to have ready are your academic transcripts, your CV. There's a couple of essay questions to fill out about your motivation, what you would hope to get out of the Masters, and, you know, how you see your career developing after that, why you'd like to choose Smurfit to do it. And then you just submit your application fee, and we assess your application and get back to you from there. So it's really, really straightforward. And that's it from me. I think then just we have upcoming events that you may be very interested in if you're willing to, or you'd like to hear more, should I say, on our program. So literally on Monday, we have an overview of the Masters in Management Online with our academic director, Dr. Teddy Skitty. And that will give you a great insight into, you know, the modules, what it covers, how the teaching is done. So it's well worth coming online to see that. And that's on Monday afternoon. And then we have another webinar coming in March, which seems a long way off now, but it really isn't in terms of our academic year. And again, it will give you more insight into the program, how it operates. And typically we'll talk to some students that are currently studying or graduates, and you'll get that insight as well. Very briefly, all application queries, you can see my email address there. I'm the admissions manager. And for any queries on the program itself, there's another email address there, msc_management@UCD or mgt@ucd.ie. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Mairead. I'll jump in here. My name is Ger Dooley. I'm the program manager for the Smurfit School's part-time Masters in Management Online. And I'm going to collate questions that have come in on foot of our questions and answers. Okay, so if you have any more questions and answers for Ashley, questions rather, please do send them in. Ashley, you're still with us. Can I throw a question that's come into you?
I'll do my best, yeah.
So somebody has asked a question with regards to narcissistic managers. So somebody has been, and one of our anonymous attendees has put in a question about having a narcissistic manager, worked with them for 4 months or so, and the behavior seems to be escalating. They're trying to put a frame around the behavior, but it's difficult because of, and I quote, cunning behavior. HR not exactly being helpful. Sounds like a very challenging environment for the person. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one when you don't have the HR backing. What we do know about that kind of characteristic is that they're hugely ambitious. And the one way that they do respond to change is if you can position it as something that will help advance their career. So if you could bring them to insight around, like, for example, we know that, you know, technical skill gets you hired, but your people management skills get you promoted. So if this individual, and I don't know whether it's possible because we don't have so much context, but if you could position it so that, you know, well, if you want to get to the next level, and clearly you have the talent and the capability, but this is an area that you probably need to make some adjustments on. That it's feeding into their motivations for what they want to achieve. And that's how you have going head on in a conflict is not going to manage it at all. But trying to figure out what their goal is, and then trying to see if you can sort of shape their behavior a little bit around, well, if you look at all the top leaders in this organization, they're really good at whatever, building teams, or they're really good at engaging with their staff or whatever. So clearly this is what's needed to succeed. So if you could put that sort of a frame on it, that's the way I think I would go. But
Yeah,
as I say, I wish them well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a case of taking a step back and looking at the broader picture, and that's easier said than done. Obviously, if the person's still with us, that's easier said than done. But yeah, the very best of luck with that. And I hope that Ashley's question was helpful. And indeed, I think a lot of the content that we've heard in the last hour or so has been helpful. A lot of the other stuff coming in QAs is just all praise for yourself, Ashley, for an excellent session, which is great to hear. We have 2 minutes left, so if anyone else does have a question for Ashley, you can type it into the Q&A box. I'm keeping an eye on it. I would say that Ashley, a lot of what you spoke there about in terms of the personalities of leaders was very interesting. I really like the you know, and the circumstances they find themselves in, especially I like the analysis of Eric Ten Hag's demise in Manchester United, especially. I'm sure my bias is there, but in terms of maybe we had a lot of questions come in from people beforehand with regards to from the manager's perspective, and I know that you dealt with that in terms of the person who is cognizant of potentially entering that zone. Do you feel that there is not enough, this is a question from myself, to wrap things up, do you feel that maybe managers themselves can do more as a kind of a collective whole to start thinking about these things? Is things moving in that direction?
Oh, I think hugely so, Ger. Like, I think, you know, if I'm a manager in the middle of an organization, and maybe I'm in the foothills of managing people, so I'm learning my skills, my advice would be to actively work on developing emotional intelligence, which we know is something that can be learnt and developed. It's not some magic dust that you have or haven't. You learn it. And what you want to do is to be able to pick up on the subtle information and the undercurrents around you, to be able to read the room of where your team are at. And the second thing I would say is to get the three things: work on your emotional intelligence. Secondly, have a really clear understanding of your strengths and weaknesses, and get that perspective from different audiences. And also start listening to people to consider what effect or impact your behavior has on others. So if you could make it your sort of your list to start working on those three things through engagement with people and those around you. I think the more that I work with a super CEO in Cork, and she actively seeks this information from different people. Like she gets it from her work colleagues, but interestingly, she also consults with, you know, people who know her really well, you know, her partner, her adult children. So the more different voices, and peer to peer. In Ireland, we're not good on peer to peer feedback and support, and I think there's huge scope there to do something where we can all learn to be better versions of ourselves.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ashley. I might pass it back over to Aisling now if you have any wrapping up comments to make, Aisling.
Yes, thank you. What a fantastic session. I could listen to you for another hour if we had the time. We have a few people there just asking about if they're going to get the recording and the slides, and you are. We will send them to you in the coming days, so likely next week, early next week. Just keep an eye on your inbox and we'll send you on all the information as well. With that, sorry, Maria, did you have something there?
Yes, sorry, Ger, could I just ask you to comment on what level or experience of leader the Masters is geared towards in management?
For sure, Mairead. So it's geared at any level, to be honest. This is a very broad program, the Part-Time Masters in Management Online, and we cater for people that are coming in at varying levels of management. So if you are in a position where you aspire to be a manager, or if you are in a position where you are a senior manager, there is enough on this program for both. And it brings you together. The class cohort really brings together a pretty unique dynamic of people who want to, maybe they're early on in their careers, they're finished off their undergraduate studies, or maybe you're in the last year of their undergraduate studies. They're looking forward to what is to come next. They want to be a manager in the future. They see that in their future path. Absolutely, this is a perfect program for them, as would be people who find themselves maybe in a role where they almost by accident find themselves as a manager and they want to get the theory and the know-how. This program is good for them, but also people who are experienced managers as well. And I'm absolutely certain that after listening to Ashley for the last hour, you'll understand that there is always room for growth, room for more knowledge and information. And this program, the Part-Time Masters Online, would certainly cater for those people as well.
That's great. Thanks, Ger. And we'll send any information and links that you need if you're interested in doing the MSc in Management. We UCD Smurfit as well. So with that, we'll let you get back to your day. Just a massive thank you to Ger, Mairead, and obviously Ashley, who presented a brilliant webinar. And there's more webinars there on screen. If you're interested, make note of them. We'll send them to you in our database anyway, closer to the time. Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.